What is originalism? So originalism does not mean that the originalist accepts only the original Constitution, but not all the amendments that came later on. Instead, originalism refers to a way of reading laws from the past. It's an argument about how a jurist, a lawyer, a law professor, a judge, how a jurist should read documents written in the English language in the past. In fact, it's not even strictly about law. It's not necessarily about reading a legal document from the past. It's any document from the past. Okay? It's how any of us should read things that were written before our time. Okay? Whether it's laws or novels or wills or shopping lists. Okay? So originalists argue that to understand the meaning of a document from the past, you need to understand what the words meant at the time they were written and to apply that meaning. That to understand what the person who wrote those words meant, you need to understand what certain words and phrases that were used meant at the time they were written, rather than the meaning today, which might be different. Okay, so for example, let's say you're reading a novel from the 1850s, okay? And you see there a character, say John, who is described as gay. Okay? John was noticeably gay. Okay? So what should you as a reader today, in 2021, what should you make of this? Should you understand from this sentence, John was noticeably gay, that John was a homosexual? Because today, gay means homosexual. Or should you understand from this sentence that John was noticeably happy and cheerful, because in 1850, gay meant happy and cheerful? Okay, so when the author wrote that sentence in 1850, the usage of the word gay, the meaning of the word gay, was happy and cheerful. Okay? And I don't think I need to explain that this is a consequential question for you as a reader. Okay? Because you'll read in the book that John courted Betty and asked her to marry him. Okay? So if John is merely a happy, cheerful guy, then okay, that's there's no problem to be concerned about. But if you read it as with a modern understanding of the word gay, if you chose to read that sentence and understand from it that he is a homosexual man, then this reading casts this relationship with Betty in a whole new light. Okay, so you will understand everything that follows very differently if you choose to read gay the way, according to what gay means in 2021, versus if you choose to read gay based on what gay meant in 1850. Okay, you might even wonder, wait a second, he's marrying Betty, but he's gay. So is Betty a man or a woman? Okay, so this is the question that all of us confront when we read documents from the past, because language, of course, changes over time. Terms change over time. Coins of phrase. That's not the term. But turns of phrase change over time. They mean different things. Okay? So most of us have, I think most of us have the good sense to understand that to understand what the author tried to convey to me, the reader, we need to understand the words as they were understood when the author wrote them. not as they're understood today. But many lawyers and law professors and judges argue against this method. For example, let's say the state of Texas passed a law, again in 1850, saying that in foreclosure cases, Texas courts shall not confiscate a man's horses. Okay? So the law passes, everything's fine, but time moves on, and here we are in 2021, and let's say the courts initiate foreclosure proceedings against Jane Doe, a woman, and the courts, or the foreclosure judge, confiscates her car, among other things. Okay? So she appeals, and she says, hey, you can't take my car because the law from 1850 says that you can't take a man's horse. Okay? Now, her non-originalist lawyer would explain that, yes, the 1850 law says man, but back then, 99% of ranches were owned by men, and that's why the law said man. But in 2021, women own ranches, and so we should interpret the words, we should read, and we should understand the words, the court shall not confiscate a man's horse, as the court shall not confiscate a person's horse. Also, the lawyer would say, in 1850, there were no cars. So horses were the only mode of transportation. Okay. So today we should understand the word horse to mean any vehicle. Okay, that vehicles should not be taken in foreclosure cases. Okay, so that's a non-originalist, that's a lawyer calling for reading old words as they are understood today. And an originalist would say that we are bound by the law. Okay? And the law means what the legislature that passed it meant. So an originalist would point to evidence that actually that in 1850, man could mean person. That often, I won't go into it now, but it was a common usage since the Middle Ages to the 20th or maybe 21st century, that the male singular could be was a generic term for a person. Okay, so if you said in 1850 or 1950, a man's home is his castle, or a man cannot live on bread alone, people understood that you didn't mean this as a statement about men rather than women. Okay, it was understood, even though it says a man's home, it was understood as a person. Okay, so an originalist would say the law, the originalist would say that men and women are covered by this statute, by this law. Because in 1850, man could mean man or woman. Okay? However, the originalists would say that there's no evidence that the word horse meant mode of transportation. He'd say that the 1850 legislature that passed this law, when they said horse, when people in 1850 said horse, they meant horse. They did not mean any other form of transportation, like a donkey or an ox or a wagon. Okay? So the originals would say the law covers only horses and not oxes and donkeys, etc. And therefore, this woman's car today is not protected against foreclosure. So if we want the law to protect cars in foreclosure cases, we can easily ask our legislatures to pass a new law saying that in foreclosure cases, Texas courts shall not confiscate a person's horses or any other mode of transportation. We can pass a new law and be governed by that law, by the new law. But as long as the old law is the law of the land, we need to adhere to what the law says. We're governed by the law. Okay? So again, so the question is about, again, reading the English language. Okay? What does the law mean? Does it mean what the legislature meant when it wrote that statute and enacted it? Or does it mean what we today think it should mean? Okay, that a horse actually means a car, can mean a car. Okay? And you see this in action, for example, with the in a real debate rather than a hypothetical debate about foreclosures and horses, with the First Amendment. Okay? The First Amendment says clearly, again, pen on paper, that Congress shall pass no laws restricting speech, assembly, etc. Now, a non-originalist, armed with the incorporation doctrine and the theory, the doctrine of the living constitution, etc., says that yes, it says Congress, okay, the federal Congress, the federal government, shall pass no law on these issues, but we can understand it as any government shall pass no law. Okay, the municipal government, the county, the state, and the federal too. Okay? Whereas an originalist would say, no. Congress shall pass no law means that Congress shall pass no law. It leaves other legislatures and local governments, you know, your city hall, your mayor, et cetera, are completely free to do all these things, you know, to pass laws restricting speech, assembly, blah, blah, blah. Of course, unless that state or that municipality has a rule against it, a law against it, or a constitution that says that the government cannot do these things. But the point is that the originalists would say the First Amendment refers, the First Amendment means what it says, that the Congress doesn't have the authority to pass laws on these issues. But that's it. It does not restrict other legislatures throughout the United States, lower legislatures. Or take an even easier case to adjudicate, to see this in action in terms of original meaning and evolving meaning. If you look at the Constitution's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, okay, non-originalists argue strongly and consistently for years that this prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment means that the death penalty is unconstitutional should be unconstitutional in this country because it is cruel, it's severe, obviously, and it's unusual in Western democracies because the United States is one of the few, maybe the only one, that that still practices the death penalty, still allows the death penalty. So they say, look, it's unusual, it's cruel. The Constitution says no cruel and unusual punishment. Therefore, it should be illegal, unconstitutional. Originalists, on the other hand, say that we know for a fact, okay, this is not speculative, we know for a fact that the legislature, that the delegates in the Federal Convention that wrote this Constitution and the legislatures or the ratifying conventions in the states that ratified the Constitution in 1787-88, they definitely did not think that the death penalty was cruel or unusual. Okay, how do we know this? Because the Constitution itself explicitly demands the death penalty in cases of treason. Okay, so we know if they themselves demanded the death penalty and they outlawed cruel and unusual punishment, it means that they did not think that the death penalty was cruel and unusual. So this brings to the fore this conflict. Okay? originalists say that we have to be bound, if we're a country of laws, if we are to be governed by a constitution, by what the constitution says, then we must be bound by the constitution that they enacted, rather than pouring new meaning, new standards, modern standards from our society, from our time, into the Constitution's words. Okay, so if we want to outlaw the death penalty, we can pass a law tomorrow. Okay, Congress, all Congress has to do is pass a law saying that the death penalty is that the death penalty shall not be administered in the United States, except, of course, for the case of treason, because that's the only case in which, the only circumstance in which the Constitution, which is higher than any law, mandates the death penalty. Okay, so Congress can pass a law if we want to ban capital punishment. So, whereas the other side, the living constitution side, the jurists who adhere to the logic of the living constitution, in which the meaning of words change as we change. Okay? They say, yes, back in the day, the death penalty was not cruel and unusual. But today, it is cruel and unusual. And therefore, we're going to, and therefore the standard is the one from today. And therefore, we don't need to pass a law banning cruel and unusual punishment. We don't need to put our Congress through the ordeal of passing a law banning capital punishment. All we have to do is get the judges, the Supreme Court, to write it, and that'll be the new law. Okay? So originalism is, as I said, it's not about the original Constitution before the amendments were added to it, but about the original meaning of words, the original meaning of an enacted law as it was written. And the battle about originalism is who determines what the law says. Is it the legislature that enacted the law back in the day, whenever that was, 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago? Or is it the person, the judge usually, either the executive, the bureaucrat in some executive office of the government, or a judge who's reading the law today? Who determines what this law says? The legislature that passed it, or the judge or office holder who's reading it today? Are we, the citizens, going to be governed by what the law that the legislature passed, or by the will of the judge or official who's reading the law today? Okay, so originalists basically say that the statutes, the law's meaning is static. Okay? The legislature meant something when it passed it, and that meaning holds, and we're bound to live by that law, by the will of that legislature, until this law is canceled or is replaced by a new law that we pass today. By contrast, the living constitution jurists say that the meaning of a law changes over time as the meanings of words evolve over time, and as a society's political beliefs evolve over time. Like, for example, what is cruel, what is unusual? So these jurists say that we are not to be governed by the will of the people who passed, but by the will of the citizens who, through their representatives, enacted the law, but rather that the meaning of the law is determined by us, the modern readers of the law, through not our representatives in the legislature, but through our judges in the courts. Okay? We didn't vote for them, but they're the ones who are going to determine what the law is. So essentially, if we return back to that original example I gave of that hypothetical book with the word gay, the living constitution jurists say that even if the novelist in 1850 wrote a book about a cheerful, straight man, the fact that today the word gay means something different means that we should read the same book as a book about a homosexual man. Okay? Because we're operating based on the changing meaning of words in the English language rather than being bound by the original or contemporary meaning of the word when it was written in that novel or in that law book. Now, in this on this issue of originalism, so this is the debate. Okay? A few years ago, when Justice Antonin Scalia passed away, all of us noticed something very interesting in that those of you who remember, Scalia's career was, Scalia was kind of the most famous or the most visible and influential originalist in public life for a long time. And his career was dedicated to the originalist, to pursuing the originalist logic in the federal courts. So he dedicated himself to ensuring that Americans were ruled by laws that were enacted by legislatures rather than being ruled by the people who happen to populate the government at any given time. Okay, the executives and judges who read old laws with new meaning. Okay, so okay, I already explained. And so the method of his constitutional jurisprudence or research was called textualism and originalism, and the text reveals is what we should be studying, and originalism referring to how we should read that text. And this method of jurisprudence was a way to protect the text of the law and the intent of the legislature that wrote it, to protect it from the will of the contemporary, of today's office holder or judge. To say that again. So it was a method to protect the text of the law and the intent conveyed in it by the legislature that passed it from the will of today's office holder or judge who's reading it. Okay, he said, what should govern is the original intent of the legislature, not the modern understanding of the judge, of today's judge. And so when he passed away, the obituaries from the constitutional conservative side of our legal culture waxed eloquently about how far he advanced textualism and originalism and what he had accomplished on that front. But those of you who remember those weeks and months know better, because you definitely remember that his death shook the citizenry, the media, and the halls of government at every level of government in our country, from federal to state to local. Okay, it created the kind of anxiety and fear about the future, or uncertainty about the future, that we associated with the death of a medieval king or Soviet dictator. And because just like in those cases, when the king dies, the new king, the will of the king is law. A new king creates a whole new body of law, like that. And here too, and the same with dictatorships. Okay? And so here, the death of a single magistrate casts profound anxieties or profound doubts about the standing and meaning of virtually every regulation and every law in America, at every level of government, in every location, from coast to coast. And the reason was there was good reason for this kind of anxiety, because when Scalia was alive, the court was 4-5, was balanced 4-5 between conservative Republicans or judges appointed by Republicans and 4 judges appointed by, actually that's not true. Some of them were appointed by Republicans. But in any case, there were 5 conservative judges and 4 liberal Democrats. Okay? And so, because when Scalia died, there was a Democrat in the White House, it motivated both political parties to really go all out to make sure that they got to name the replacement, that they got to put a new judge in Scalia's seat. Okay, because both sides understood that if Scalia was replaced by a Democratic president, the laws of this country would change without a single act of Congress. Okay? Thousands of regulations and laws passed by federal agencies, rules passed by state and federal agencies, all sorts of city ordinances in thousands of cities around America, laws passed by state legislatures, and laws passed by the federal Congress would change tomorrow without a single act of Congress. Okay? Because the majority in the court would shift from Republican, from conservative to left-wing. Okay? The Democrats, of course, were excited about this possibility, and Republicans, naturally, were fearful about this possibility. And so both parties and all citizens and all the pundits on TV demonstrated that they believed that Americans are not ruled by the law or by legislatures, but ruled by a kind of royal authority wielded by the federal bureaucracy and especially by the federal court. And so in this respect, it was a testament to how little Scalia had accomplished. His death, that maybe when he was alive, you could live under the impression that his method of originalism ruled the day and made sure that indeed the text of the law was what governed public life in this country, rather than the will of the ruler. But his death revealed that, in fact, we are ruled by people, not by laws. It revealed that what determines the meaning of the law is not the law itself, what the law says, but the person who happens to occupy a powerful post in the executive, and even more so, a powerful post in the judiciary, like that seat itself, the seat of Scalia. Okay? In any case, so that was an interesting moment that highlighted the issues involved with originalism versus the counter method of reading of the living Constitution. Now, so those are the two competing methods that are in the ring, jousting. But since I'm on this, I want to bring up a third method, which I don't think has many followers. I think, in any case, I'll tell you what it is, and you might understand why it doesn't have many followers, because it makes sense to historians, but not to many other people. So a few years, Jack Rakove is a very well-respected American historian and of early America, and he has written extensively and has appeared on TV many times to explain and to counter originalism. So he's a scholar of one of his fields is the original meaning of the Constitution and this debate about how to read the Constitution, how to understand the Constitution. And and as he explained originalism and countered it, explained why it's not a valid way to read the Constitution, he explained his own approach to constitutional interpretation. And he argued that the best guide to the meaning of a law is not language and linguistics. It's not the text of the law, either with the original meaning or with new meaning that we pour in today. So our focus should not be on language, on what the law says, but history. And again, he's a historian, I remind you. Okay, so his point, it was that jurists, judges, executives, when they interpret the law, they should not focus on the language and linguistics of the law, but on the history of the law, okay? On what the lawmakers wanted to accomplish or meant to accomplish by passing this law. Because look, maybe they were clumsy with their words. Maybe the wording was ineffective or now has become murky because of the passage of time, and we don't know exactly what they meant, et cetera, with what these words exactly meant. Okay? So therefore, we should not study the law itself, the text of the law, and submit to its provisions, either as they meant them, as what they meant back in 1850, or what we understand them to be today with the modern meaning of those words. Instead, we should study those powerful people, those legislators who wrote the law, examine, determine what they wanted to accomplish by this law, regardless of how they expressed it, and submit to their will. Okay, so that the meaning of the law is trapped in the heads of the legislators who passed it, not in the words that they wrote. That's his method. Okay, and it highlights the question that also comes up with originalism and the living constitution of whether a society. This is a formulation that John Adams articulated when I think he was involved in the drafting of the Massachusetts Constitution. And he said that the great struggle of the American Revolution and of self-government in general is whether a society is to be governed by laws or by people. Whether they should be governed by the will of the people who pass laws and therefore submit to those laws, or are they going to be governed by powerful people, by the will of a king, a president, a judge, etc. So Rakove's, I don't know if you can see the implications of Rakove's method, this third method of constitutional jurisprudence that he's suggesting, but it's problematic in three different ways. Okay? First, it's applied inconsistently. Second, it's literally impossible to follow. And third, to John Adams' point, it makes our government more arbitrary. Okay, so let me just explain quickly and we'll wrap it up. So first, it's applied inconsistently. And as a historian, it always irks me that that we deploy a different rule for people in the past than we do to ourselves. Okay? I doubt that Jack Rakove or people that adhere to this historical method of jurisprudence, I doubt that he would argue that a law passed today by our legislature today should be executed not based on what the law itself said, but on what the lawmakers meant. And that's because we know that our lawmakers pick words to convey their intent. Okay? The law, therefore, is what we follow. Okay? We elect these lawmakers. They choose the words that convey what their intent is, and therefore the law conveys their intent, and we follow the law. Okay? We don't need to interview the legislator. Okay? We don't need to interview the Speaker of the House and the Speaker of the Senate or the leader of the Senate and ask them, what did you mean by this law? Okay? We have the law. Okay? So we trust when it's our laws, we trust that the law itself reveals the legislator's intent. But for some reason, when we approach laws that were written in the past, we don't use that same method. Okay, we're told that we shouldn't adopt that. We shouldn't work with that standard because maybe they didn't know English very well then, or maybe they didn't. Maybe they were country bumpkins and couldn't articulate themselves very well. Okay. So again, I think it's a historical. It's something that historians, or pre-modern historians, I think have. It grates us that the people in the present look down on people in the past. And in any case, the point is that this method that Rakove is suggesting is applied inconsistently. It's not applied. It is not applied to our laws. Okay? For the laws that we pass, we use language and linguistics as our guide to understanding what the law means. But in any case, and therefore, for the sake of consistency, we should use language and linguistics as a guide when we read laws that were enacted yesterday, last year, last decade, or 200 years ago, or at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. That's one thing. The second is that it really is impossible to follow this method of using history as a guide. Because even if we wanted to replace the textual method and follow the historical method of analysis of jurisprudence, we cannot know the lawmaker's intent. Okay? Not only because we cannot read hearts and minds, but because we don't really know who the lawmakers were. Okay? Laws are written by committees. Okay? So are we to seek, and by the way, these are all dead people. Okay? Even if we could get to all, even if we could identify everyone who was involved in it, they're all dead. Okay? But the point is, whose mind are we supposed to read? Are we to seek out the intent of each and every committee member, including the backbenchers who are following their leaders and kind of rubber stamping? Do we seek out the intent only of those committee members who argued for the bill, or also the intent of those who argued against the bill, or against certain provisions of it? Do we seek out the intent only of of legislators, or also of their aides who actually do most of virtually all of the research and the writing and the drafting before it's taken up by the committee? And if we're going to avoid all these people, or should we just investigate the mind, the intent of the committee chair, or the leading Democrat and the leading Republican? and consider, what if those who drafted the bill purposefully used misleading language to gain votes of would-be opponents? In that case, the original intent of those who drafted the bill was different than the original intent of those who actually voted for the bill and enacted it into law. And since laws are enacted not by those who draft them, but by those who vote for them, are we to use Rakov's historical approach to examine the intent of all the congressmen of the voting majority that passed the bill into law? Okay, so this is clearly a method that's more conducive to endless debating rather than to arriving at definitive conclusions, which I think explains why historians are more open to this method of understanding the Constitution than jurists, because jurists need to arrive at a decision at some point. Okay, so they'll either adopt the living Constitution or originalism and produce a result. Historians, you'll write a book, I'll write a different book. There's no consequences. We don't have to, there are no practical consequences of having this debate, and we don't need to arrive at an end verdict. Okay. Okay, so okay, I'll add one more thing. The thing is that, as I said, we cannot ascertain for certainty the intent of the lawmakers, because, like I said, we don't know who they were. We don't know how, which lawmakers, aides and congressmen, or just these or those congressmen. So it's hard to read the minds and the hearts and minds of people who are long dead, even the ones who are alive, in fact. But what we can ascertain with greater competence is the meaning of the text. We have access to the text. Okay? So we can interpret the text itself by living Constitution method, by originalism method, doesn't matter. Because the beauty of studying the text is that there's only one law to study, one text, rather than innumerable lawmakers. And when we study the text, we just have to know the English language rather than mind reading. Okay, so granted, today's English is more, we understand today's English better than 19th century English, and better still than 18th century English. Okay? But 18th century English is not a foreign language to us. Okay? If we can read and understand novels like Robinson Crusoe and Gulliver's Travels, then we can read and understand our Constitution. And if a word or a concept isn't clear to us, then we have philological tools to investigate what it meant in the 18th century when it was written. Just like when we read Robinson Crusoe. Okay, there are words that we don't understand, and so we go to a dictionary or try to understand based on something else in the book. Okay, the last problem with Rakov's method is that it makes our government more arbitrary. Okay, so let's assume that we will put aside the two technical issues that I just raised about the historical method. Okay. The result, again, going back to John Adams's formulation of a government of men, government of laws, not men. Do we really want, politically, philosophically, do we want to live in a society governed by the lawmaker's intent rather than the lawmaker's written law? When our society transitioned, still transitioning, from common law to statutory law, it reflected a desire on the part of citizens to make the law itself sovereign, and thus to make the law less arbitrary, less subject to the whim or the perspective or the interest of the ruler or the judge. Okay? More predictable for plaintiffs and defendants. So a legal system that looks past the law to the lawmaker's intent or will is by design more arbitrary and less predictable. Because again, trying to read hearts and minds of various lawmakers is so speculative and so plastic that it creates easy avenues for police chiefs and prosecutors and regulators and mayors and governors and presidents and judges to find various things, to find whatever lawmaker intent makes sense to them. Okay, so you become more dependent on that powerful person, the mayor, the judge, the president, the governor, rather than being dependent or being subject to the law itself.